Okay, picking up where we left off, we in our load settings, we're instantiating our guestbook and we're validating that it has the same module ID that we've already checked security against. If it didn't, it would indicate URL manipulation. Now, how would that work in the URL? Well, we've got our edit page. If we click that, you see in the query string, we've got the page ID, module ID, and the item GUID. Now, if someone manipulates these parameters, then they could try that to see if they could bypass our security. So previously, when we weren't checking for this item GUID to actually belong to the module, you could have had a potential privilege escalation where someone, say, had permissions to edit a blog somewhere else in the site, even on a different page. They could put the page ID and the module ID of their blog, and that first security check would say, hey, yes, that page does have that module, and then we'd retrieve that item and we would just go ahead and edit it or delete it, and we didn't even validate that it really belonged to that module. So that extra item level check is needed to make sure that you're not having your query string manipulated or to enforce security correctly. Going back to the code, I also wanted to talk about a couple of other little things for forcing security. For example, if you had a feature with sensitive data, you could go if SSL is available, and then that would make it force SSL on this page. So that's something you can do if needed. All depends on the feature, probably not that important for a guestbook. We looked at our Mojo base page method. I want to go in there quickly again, and you saw we have this web user, which is different than site user. We check site user down here. Site user is kind of a database object, and web user is just a wrapper that is useful for checking the role cookie. We don't even have to hit the database to check what roles the user's in. We're just checking against a cookie, so that's much more efficient, and you want to use that whenever possible. When you do need to actually, compare something against the user, use the site utils get current user method, and that makes sure that in any given request, we only look up that user from the database once, because what it does, if you go to it, is it stores the user in the HTTP context of the current requests, and then if it's already there, just, if you call this method somewhere else from code and it's already there, it just returns the one that's already in the context. It doesn't look it up twice. So that's helpful. So this web user has a few handy things that check against specific named roles, but you can also pass in a semicolon separated list of roles. So we keep a property on our page for edit roles, and we can pass in, is the user in one of these roles? That's a very convenient helper method we have. And you can also do individual role. There's is in role, but is in roles is generally the handiest. You can use it to check against anything you've got roles stored at. And later on, I will show you in another clip how to actually create a module setting where you could have a custom permission that you're going to, grant to roles. Okay, now a couple other little things I want to talk about in here. When we delete and when we save, we're doing this setup redirect. Now, what that method does, you might be used to using response.redirect. Now, response.redirect has a Boolean parameter at the end of it, whether to end the request or not. And typically if you say true, that's going to end that request. But what will happen if you're doing a lot of response.redirecting in a web application is you start to get thread abort exceptions occurring, which these happen from the redirect that's cutting off execution. So we've implemented a helper method, this web util setup redirect, that does a little softer redirect. And it's used not only here, I'm using it directly, but also it's used internally inside this redirect here. And that's why we have this return here. You see, when you're doing the soft kind of redirect, it redirects, but it doesn't execute. The current requested page continues executing the code. And so you can have, even though we've solved the thread abort problem, you could have side effects if your code continues to run even though the user's now gone on to another page. So whenever you do a redirect using, like if I were using WebUtil's redirect directly right here, I definitely need a return. I also need it when I'm using this method. I didn't necessarily need it down here in this button click, although it's probably just a good practice to always put return anytime after you use this redirect. But the reason I don't really need it in the button click is because there's no other code that's going to run after this. The page load runs before the button click, so all that code already ran. There's just nothing else that's going to run in this execution path. So if you're doing it in page load, it's particularly important because if you leave out this return here, then this code would continue executing even though the user's been redirected. And we don't necessarily want that. That can lead to other kinds of errors. So just making a note of, that's just a common problem that can happen with the regular response.redirect. We solved that problem, but you've got to know how to use it or you can create other problems from it. Okay, now we saw that our edit functionality wasn't working when we tested it. I tried to update Homer's guest book and it just didn't change it. Now the reason for that is we've got a logic error here, and this is again all about understanding the sequence of events. Page load is always going to fire before the button clicks, okay? So when I click that save button, page load's going to fire, and then my button click's going to fire. Well, what's happening in page load, right? We're calling populate controls, and we're resetting the text boxes to their original values. So the change I made in the edit comment text box is now wiped back to its original before the save event happens, and therefore it wasn't updating. So basically what we want to do in that kind of situation is wrap a if not is post back. And page is the intrinsic object of ASP.NET. It's actually the base class behind Mojo base page. And it's what default pages are made of is page. So we have that method here. And that way now when we click our button click, we'll still come through. All of this code is going to execute, but it's going to check that and say, no, I'm not going to populate the controls. And then my button click will finally fire, and then we'll update. So I'm going to rebuild, and then I'm going to refresh the browser page. And then I'm going to click and edit the Homer Simpson one again. And then I'm going to save, and it still didn't work. Oh well, I'm going to have to figure that one out. Okay, looking into the cause of why our saving isn't working, we just have to go to this definition on repository.save, and you'll see we never implemented the update. So we're only creating so far. So let's see if we uncomment that, whether or not that exists. Let's go to DB guestbook and see how much we did, if anything. We've got one here. I'm not sure we created our stored procedure or anything. I'm going to go ahead and create that and come back and see you in the next video with that already done.